O'Brien Kaaba from SAIPAR and University of Zambia. So we will like to invite everyone that is watching the panel and following us to post questions on the chat while you are listening, and my colleague Ricker will bring those questions to the panelists. And we would address some of these questions in the middle of the panel and some at the end. This panel will have a total duration of 1 hour. So my first question is to you, Morten. As director of the Raoul Wallenberg Institute, you have been supporting human rights cities initiatives in different countries, but also in Sweden. Can you briefly tell our audience what are the 3 characteristics of a human rights city?
Thank you very much, Anna, and thanks for this great initiative. And it's good to see many good friends, and also seeing people from Stellenbosch, where I've spent a lot of time working many years ago, and other nice places in the region. Let me first of all underline that I think when we look at human rights cities across countries, across continents, we see many different features, all depending on the local situation. And that is what it should be. I mean, always need to be adjusted. And in particular, the closer we get to the realities on the ground, the more it needs to take flavor of what is that particular setting. Of course, still with the respect for the human rights framework, which is there to give us guidance. But 3 particular issues that I'll point to. First of all, that the leadership in the city has decided that it wants to embark upon integrating human rights into its policies, procedures, and specific actions. So basically that it is a decision from the very high level, because that is the way to give it and make it sustainable. And that is the city as employer, as service provider, as democracy provider, and as responsible for the public space. I would say that these are the 4 key areas that have also been identified in the Swedish context. Secondly, that the city relates closely to its citizens. Ask them about their concerns. Ask the children, why do they drop out? How the minorities feel treated? How safe do women feel moving around in the public space? Don't shy away from asking them. And it sounds easy, but I have to say, and I'll probably come back to that later, it is not a common feature, but it gives so much insight to what is it that we should do in order to meet the human rights or protect the human rights of the people living here. And then, of course, engaging them in finding solutions to the challenges. And in this way, the city can also contribute to, let's say, regain trust in democratic processes and build trust in general if they're sincerely listened to what are your problems and they're engaged in finding the solutions. Certainly, I would say what a feature is that it basically also create better working conditions that we in some cities basically see that really sort of say entering into a human rights-based approach, see lower level of sick leave, which is a very nice indicator. It breaks down the silos between different departments, so you get a more coherent approach to solving some of the challenges in the local community. So I see these 3 components are some of the key elements.
Thank you, Morten. And I think it's really interesting that you mentioned the importance that municipalities and local governments have for achieving human rights, as you said, as employer, as service provider, as organizer of the public space, and how important it is to work closely with the citizens. And this is an important link to the democracy aspect, the local democracy of the human rights cities. I want to give the word now to Jaap. And I want to ask you, our municipalities that are starting this journey of these partnerships closely linked to the issues of human rights, they are in the beginning. So we want to think about challenges, about what are the problems that right now, what are the things that they should consider when working with human rights in South Africa at the local level.
Thanks, Anna, and thanks for the opportunity to be part of this panel. And I'll try to sort of give content to the answer to your question, referring to some of the challenges here in South Africa, and also taking maybe a slightly broader view as well. Because I think the first question that one would have to ask is, what is the role and place of human rights in your country? Because I think there's sometimes also a bit of a taking for granted that human rights are embedded and respected and fulfilled, and that there is a rule of law, and that human rights are enforceable, and that you can claim them in court, and that the courts will be on your side. That is a given, I think, in most European countries, if not all. But unfortunately, we don't always have that same scenario on the continent of Africa, where sometimes human rights are not respected, and there's the absence of rule of law, or an incomplete rule of law, or there are real gaps in the way that human rights are being enforced. So I think that's an important precursor to the debate, and that obviously plays a role in local government as well. Then secondly, I think the content of the human rights framework is also important. Does it, for example, include socioeconomic rights? In South Africa, we have enforceable socioeconomic rights, and they play a key role in local government. The right to water, sanitation, housing, those are entrenched in our constitution, are enforceable. You can claim a violation to that right in court. And that has made quite an impact on the way local governments have had to shape their policies and procedures and the content of their delivery. Because municipalities are responsible for many basic services that directly link to these enforceable socioeconomic rights. So much of what we see in local government in South Africa, for example, the concept of free basic services, comes from this human rights paradigm. But we also, the other sort of chapter to your Bill of Rights will be the classic civil and political rights, the equality, freedom of movement, privacy, and all the rights that we know from the more sort of classic category of human rights. And they also play a role in local government. For example, does the municipality as an employer or as a service provider practice equality, and not just treating everyone the same, but also substantive equality? Does it make an effort to fix past injustices and redress for women, for marginalized groups, for historically disadvantaged groups? Does that play a role in the way the municipality hires, procures, and manages itself? The right to privacy, we spoke about it in the earlier session, the installation of cameras in streets and public places, the increasing use of gated communities, and the use of public spaces. Municipalities play a key role in that, and they have to do this with a human rights framework. The right to freedom of religion. What role do municipalities play in limiting religious expression? Those are very practical things. Noise pollution and mosques, is a theme, and municipalities need to, approach those kinds of issues, knowing full well that there's a human rights framework that applies. A very big one in South Africa is the right to demonstrate. Every day we have protests, and sometimes those protests turn violent. And people block the streets and block highways, and municipalities are often the target of those protests, but they also play a role in managing those protests. And how do you do that whilst still acknowledging and respecting the right to protest? So I think on both spectrums, the service delivery issues, as well as the civil and political rights issues, there are big challenges for municipalities in respecting and realizing human rights. Thanks, Anna.
Thank you, Jaap, and excellent that you point us to really the important role of the municipalities in safeguarding all these different human rights that you mentioned, and also to remind us that the reality of human rights in many countries is not the same as in Sweden, that it's something that cannot be taken for granted, and it's something that is a struggle as well, and that we here see, of course, an important role also for the municipalities to learn and to engage in the protection and safeguarding of human rights. I would like to give the word now to Shirley. And Shirley, you would like, if it's okay, to take us now to Botswana, and as Jaap did, to help us to think about what are the main challenges for human rights in Botswana, and to think also about, is this a word that is used, are human rights at the center of the political debate, or they are not? Like, what do you see as the challenges? And I don't know, Shirley, are you here with us? I don't know. Because we cannot see you, and we've been having trouble with the connection with Botswana the whole day. So while we get a little bit of a response from Shirley, then let's give the word to O'Brien, and then you will move us to Zambia. So please, if you can tell us a little bit about the situation of human rights in Zambia and the challenges for local governments to uphold human rights.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me to be part of the panel discussion. So in terms of Zambia, I think the starting point would be to indicate that we have a written constitution and we have an enforceable Bill of Rights, even though the Bill of Rights in the constitution only relates to civil and political rights. However, in December 2019, we got an interesting judgment from the Supreme Court indicating that socio-economic rights could be enforced provided that we are connected to an already existing right in the Constitution. And in that specific case, it is something that related to the right to food for people in detention. So coming to the challenges, specific challenges that affect the local government in relation to human rights. So in the context of Zambia, I think before we come to the specific issues affecting local government itself, I think we have to appreciate the current context in which local governments are operating. When you look at the events in the last 10 years or so, the democratic credentials of the country have been diving. Actually, in 2020, last year, VDM listed Zambia as among the 10 countries autocratizing. So yeah, we have basically lost most of the democratic credentials we had as a country. So we are sort of nose diving into autocracy. So in that context, I think human rights are being assaulted from every angle. So we are facing huge challenges and institution oversight institutions, which are supposed to be the last refuge, are also co-opted as instruments of repression. So in this context, it becomes difficult for local governments to stand out and challenge central administration. We had a few instances last year. I think 2 mayors were suspended by central government because they couldn't agree with the position of central government on some issues. So when you have such a context, it basically means local governments have to navigate carefully when dealing with central government. That said, I think there are 3 specific issues, I think, which probably structure that affect how local governments see themselves in relation to human rights and provision of services. The first one for me, I think, is lack of clarity in the mandate of local government in terms of what services local governments should provide and those which should fall to central government. So we have a schedule in the Constitution that tries to distribute these responsibilities, but the Constitution doesn't have an implementing mechanism for those provisions in the Constitution. So basically what that does is to leave everything to the discretion of central government to determine what should go to the local government. So in those circumstances, it becomes difficult for local government to implement. But even where local government implements, I think the social context is that local governments have been seeing their mandate not as part of human rights, but they've been seeing their mandate as simply providing these services, but not seeing that as a human rights requirement that they should provide the services they provide. So in some context, I think you see local government coming out as if they are providing charity to people instead of providing a service which is required of them. The second issue is the issue of capacity. I think services are seen, for example, in terms of providing water-related services, street lighting, decongesting sewer systems, blockages in drainages, and that kind of stuff. So from this perspective, one would think the services are not conceptualized from a human rights perspective, and the people who are employed are predominantly people who have qualifications in those services which are supposed to be implemented by local government. So, for example, usually in many local government entities, only one officer is required to have, for example, legal qualifications, and the rest people who have qualifications in the areas of services local government entities are supposed to provide. And then the third one, I think, which is a major challenge in our context, is that there is a perennial problem of underfunding the local government. So this is basically because central government has taken away the means of raising resources. So all the resources generally raised locally go to the account of central admin, except for small insignificant taxes. But also even there, the practice is that those areas are usually given to political supporters, and they get the small amounts which are paid. So what this has done is to divest local authorities of resources that need for provision of these services, and also for funding their own overheads and paying salaries to workers. So what has happened over the years is that local authorities in many cases are unable to pay salaries. And there's actually a protest, an ongoing protest, for example, for one of the local authorities in the eastern part of the country, where workers haven't been paid for something like 8 months. So they've been they haven't been receiving salaries for 8 months. So in the context where you have a local authority fighting for the survival of its own employees, and salaries are not forthcoming, it becomes impossible that they think of the rights of the service, the people who are supposed to receive the services. So in this context, I think it becomes difficult for the discourse on service provision of local government to be framed as a human rights requirement. So thank you.
Thank you, O'Brien. I hear from the chat that we want to ask everyone to speak slowly and to put yourselves so that people can watch your faces. Great to hear about the difficulties that you mentioned in Zambia, and the challenges are different in each country, and it's important to really be aware. It's hard to talk about human rights and employment when not even the employees of the municipality municipalities have secured their salaries, for instance. So of course, it's all these different levels of challenges that are important for our municipalities that are starting these partnerships to understand what are the possibilities. And of course, what you mentioned, the mentality that providing services is giving charity to the people and not actually providing a service and upholding the rights. So it is really relevant what you mentioned. I want to give the word now to Morten, and I want to ask you about the Swedish municipalities. It is easy to think from an African perspective that everything is really good in Sweden. Do they actually have challenges when it comes to human rights? Can you give us a little bit of a hint of what are the challenges on the other side?
Thank you. And before I answer, I will definitely do that. I just one comment to what O'Brien said that sort of struck me, and that was you talked about the waste removal and sort of the different technical levels in the municipality. And one thing we saw in one city we worked in that was in Indonesia, where they worked exactly on the waste removal from a human rights perspective. And one of the effects, the impact of it was that those who worked really in the street gained an enormous pride from doing it when they suddenly realized that they were part of a human rights agenda. Basically, this was part of right to health, right to life, and other human rights. It sort of changed the perspective and actually the way they then conducted their work subsequently is told to be, let's say, more profound and also reaching out to some of the more vulnerable groups that maybe have been somewhat overlooked before. So again, it's one of these byproducts of getting a human rights-based approach to the work and all the different dimensions of the work in the city. In Sweden, and I would say probably in Northern Europe, there is a certain level of here everything is fine. And I can tell you one thing that really kills is we don't even have the word in Danish or in Swedish. I am Danish, working in Sweden, is a complacency. Basically that everything is fine. We don't really have to perform better, because then it really starts going downhill. So I think the first barrier to bypass in Sweden is basically to see that there is that there are issues. That first of all, that there are human rights challenges that we have to meet up front, which are there, and secondly, to recognize that even that a human right, even though there may not be a direct violation, then that a human rights-based approach can add value to the work that is already being done. You take a welfare state system where you say, whoa, they really reached a very high level in the health, education, etc. But now with the Corona crisis, I definitely think we throughout the Northern Europe, including Sweden, have a lot of inequality has been revealed. When you look to who actually were left behind, it's all about ethnicity, persons with mental health problems, etc. It's about not communicating in a focused manner, translating issues to other languages, make cultural translation, reading out to people with cognitive disabilities, etc., etc. And then you see those cities in or regions in Sweden that have gone down the avenue of a human rights-based approach, that they have done it fundamentally different. They have from day one reached out to some of the most vulnerable groups and really addressed their concerns. And this is, of course, something that we now need to analyze much deeper. We have a think tank in southern Sweden, in Skåne region, where we are looking more into try to analyze who were left behind, what were the issues, what were the barriers, what were the structural issues in the elder care leading to some of the, very high death tolls that we have seen in the Swedish elder care. So basically, I would say complacency, non-recognition, but hopefully with the Corona or the post-Corona crisis, can sort of get the eyes open that we may be able to do better. We may actually, with a human rights-based approach, lift the welfare system, the welfare state component to a next level, addressing some of the challenges. My second issue in relation to Sweden, which is somewhat linked to the first one, is that I really experienced a very, very sort of high level or a barrier in relation to ask people. I mentioned it in my first, in my answer to your first question. Basically, go and ask citizens, what are your issues? What are your challenges? There's sort of a sense that when you start the processes, there are a lot of internal processes of what is it that we're doing, what are the policies, what are the procedures, etc. And that's all fine, but it sort of stops there instead of then moving towards the citizens and really try to ask them what are the concerns. I've been in other countries, neighboring country, Norway, where it's totally the opposite, where we have to say, listen, you have to ask your staff how they see the world, because you're only engaged outside. So there are some interesting cultural differences here. But definitely, I would say in Sweden, it is very much, I mean, basically the lesson is that you need to ask both internally in the administration as well as externally. And then I would say a third and last one is that there's a tendency to only see human rights as something for the this or that minority, and not realizing and not being very good in addressing it as something that benefits everybody. And I see a big danger or risk in that, because then you certainly easily get a political polarization around human rights, that certain, I mean, those who are in favor of certain groups politically, let's call it migrants, for example, then you certainly see the opposite, then distancing themselves from the human rights agenda, instead of looking at it and say, okay, human rights are for everybody. We all benefit from freedom of expression, from freedom of assembly, again, coming back to the Corona crisis, from an inclusive park, instead of having a local park only catering for one particular group. Then how do we create a park that actually is open, is inclusive for all groups? It's much more fun for everybody, and etc. So basically having let's say a more open, a more embracing, and then as I think as Jaap also pointed to, is that this is about economic, social rights as well as civil political rights. And I think both the post-corona agenda linked to the work in the city gives us a unique opportunity for once to link civil, political, and economic social rights. I would say we can almost get back to a 1948 Universal Declaration agenda, where we had that interrelatedness, but where we saw it was divided during the Cold War. And it's sort of still very long after the Cold War has been, so it's part of the policies where in the global north, there's a weak recognition of economic social rights. I think it's there. We see the hyper inequality marring the city, really the cities, and there's an awareness that things need to change. So thank you.
Thank you, Morten. And since the people that are here with us listening are engaged in these partnerships, I think you raise a very interesting issue that in Swedish municipalities, sometimes there is this kind of fear to ask the citizens, you said, or like not to engage in public direct participation. And I think this is something where there is a big potential for mutual learning, also to learn about how cities in South Africa and Zambia and in Botswana engage with citizens. How do they ask the citizens? How do they approach them? It's something that we look forward to learn more as a mutual relation. There is one question from the audience, and I'm going to give the word to my colleague Ricard, and he will state the question for you. So Ricard, please.
Thank you. And the question is very relevant for us, especially also at the ICLD, because we work with providing support to local democracy. And the question is, if you have experiences of instances when democracy comes in collision with human rights. We see, for example, banning of begging for money in the streets, banning the flagging with the rainbow flag and things like that, or in some countries banning building minarets for that disturbing noise that can come up. So that is the question so far.
Thank you, Richard. So have you come across experiences of conflicts between human rights approach and democratic decisions? I think here the rule of the majority kind of is what we're trying to look as one of the principles of democracy, but of course, equality, and there are other principles of democracy. Yes, so Morten, I see that you want to answer, please.
Thank you, and a very good question. I would say that is probably the question that has followed me since the very beginning of my, I think, 35-year career in the human rights field. Getting that link between human rights and democracy. What is sort of that space? And I must say, my perspective is that I see it as two sides of the same coin. It's integrated, it's interrelated. I mean, democracy is all about procedures. How do we make decisions collectively in our society? How do we elect representatives? How do they vote? It's all about procedures. But the lesson learned from the Nazi regime was that even democracies can go into the extreme. I mean, Hitler was democratically elected. Let's not forget that. So there were no outer boundaries. So that was a lesson learned, why we in 1948 had the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and said, yes, democracies can do a lot. Those in power can do a lot, make a lot of decisions about how we should conduct ourselves, but there are limits. And it's these limits. So when I hear politicians say, well, I am elected, I have a popular mandate, so and I happen to have a vast majority supporting me, so I can do whatever I like to. I say, no, sorry. I mean, there are limits, and that is exactly the interconnectedness between democracy and human rights. Constitutionalism, where we have human rights catalogs in our constitutions. So, and I think a lot of the countries that are here do have much stronger human rights catalogs, definitely South Africa, than we do in many European countries. So there we have to use the international and regional human rights mechanisms. So that means that, and that's of course where we then need either constitutional courts, as we have in Germany, to actually look into whether a law is constitutionally correct, or we have national human rights institutions. We are now also making one in Sweden. You have a very, very strong one in South Africa and in Zambia as well. So we have these mechanisms then to guide the politicians in this, and that's both at the national level as well as at the local level. So I don't see a conflict between democracy and human rights. Human rights and democracy is all integrated and interrelated.
Thank you, Morten. And I think this is a good reminder for us that work with the democracy and with local governments, that there is not actual democracy if we don't uphold human rights. And as you mentioned, it's dangerous if we think the other way around. We have a lot of questions from the audience, and we also have with us, we lost Shirley because of the bad connection in Botswana, but we have with us Dorothy Mampa from University of Botswana. And Dorothy, if you're there, and if you put your camera, we will bring you into the panel. But otherwise, while that, I would like to ask Richard to take the next question that we got in the chat. Richard.
Absolutely. So the next question is, could the panel explain the role of civil society, judiciary to ensure human rights and democracy?
Who would like to take that question? Jaap. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's an excellent question. And I think we have probably a fairly positive story to tell on that score from South Africa. Obviously, we have a very strong judiciary. I think Morten already alluded to it, the fact that we have a very strong constitutional court that delivers very progressive judgments also in the area of human rights, of course. And we have a vibrant civil society, and the role of civil society has included using the human rights framework and using human rights to advocate for the upliftment of the majority in South Africa. So, to give you an example, we have lots of advocacy campaigns that have targeted national government. For example, the fact that we now have one of the most extensive programs for the free provision of HIV antiretrovirals, I think can largely be attributed to the role of civil society that took government on when it was refusing to provide antiretroviral treatment because of a strange belief in an absence of a link between HIV and AIDS. So that whole scenario was turned around with pressure from civil society groups, also using the Constitutional Court and a judgment that forced government to change its course. But to bring it to local government, I think we also have in local government, we have civil society groups that agitate and advocate with municipalities. I think the negative or the sad reality is that this is mostly located in the cities. So for example, in the city of Cape Town, we have a number of coalitions, civil society coalitions, that are probably the city of Cape Town's worst enemy, and they're always at loggerheads. But it's almost like a healthy tension in our local government sphere. And for example, it has focused on the right to protest, where the Social Justice Coalition has taken government on to say you cannot use legislation around protests and gatherings to suppress the freedom to demonstrate. When we want to demonstrate in the streets of our municipalities, we shouldn't be subjected to some sort of approval mechanism where the city approves a demonstration, yes or no. The same with their campaign for sanitation in informal settlements, using the courts to advocate and to force municipalities to sometimes they have to change their policies on how to provide basic services. I also want to make another point though, because I also think it's important that when we talk about human rights, that we also insert a dose of realism in the discussion, because government is also constrained, and the human rights framework makes provision for that. It's not a free reign. It does say you have to realize these human rights and the limits have to be reasonable. And that also applies to socioeconomic rights. So there may be funding restrictions on government's ability and municipalities' abilities to implement human rights. There may also be, and this sometimes also happens, be abuse of the human rights framework. That also happens. And we see that also in South Africa, where human rights get politicized, and advocacy groups and political groups advocate a political strategy under the guise of human rights. So it's quite a challenge sometimes for municipalities to figure out what is real and what is not real. Is this particular protest, this particular agitation around the right to housing, is it really about the right to housing for the poor, or is there some hidden political strategy and it's just convenient to do it under a human rights framework? So it's sometimes very difficult. The last point I want to make is that we also see tension sometimes between the human rights framework and the realities of local government. For example, we have a right to housing in our Bill of Rights. The Constitutional Court has said that if someone is rendered homeless in a municipality, it happens somewhere in a municipality, then in principle, that municipality is responsible for alternative housing for that person who has been rendered homeless. But the Constitution also says that local government is not actually primarily responsible to implement the right to housing. So there is a bit of a disconnection between what the human rights framework says through the Constitutional Court and the division of powers and functions elsewhere in the Constitution, obviously linked to the funding arrangement. So I'm the last one to say that the Constitutional Court was wrong with that judgment saying that homelessness is a problem for municipalities, because I think it is. It's also, I think, classically a local government issue. Homelessness is in the end must be addressed on the streets and in the municipality. But the problem is that we have a constitution that also deals with roles and responsibilities of local government, and then it says something else. And then, of course, the funding flows are linked not so much to the human rights framework, but the funding flows are linked to the formal division of powers and functions. And then there is a disconnect. So that requires further research and further advocacy, and also municipalities stating that there's a problem here, which they do. But government doesn't always want to listen. So I'm saying it's critical, the human rights approach, and it must be the guiding principle for policies and procedures and bylaws and actions. But there is also, I think, a need for a dose of realism and pragmatism to work around some of these very major challenges, which usually end up talking about funding, and that's always the biggest theme. Thanks, Anna.
Thank you, Jaap. And I think that you pointed us to a very important issue, and linking to the question on the relation between the civil society organizations, the courts, but also the realities when it comes to funding at the local level and the politicization, you said, also human rights issues. We started like by showing how amazing and how good it is to have a human rights approach, but you have showed us that it can also be problematic, it can be politicized. I see that we have Dorothy from Botswana here. Are you there, Dorothy? And if you could put your camera on, we could try to see. Yes. If you could tell us a little bit about the challenges of human rights in Botswana at the local level.
You know, in the case of Botswana, we do have a lot of challenges, particularly in the aspect of
okay, I think it's we don't hear you so well. I guess maybe let's try without the camera, if at least we can hear you.
Let me put out the camera.
Yes.
Is it better now?
It is better, please.
Yes, yes. You know, I was just saying that in Botswana, we do have a lot of challenges when it comes to human rights issues. Especially, you'll find that citizens, most of us, we are not aware of our socio-economic rights, and we tend to allow other institutions or organizations to encroach on our rights. And I think the other problem is that the passive nature of our behavior as a country, we tend to receive and not tend to question and uphold, or even force organizations to uphold what I think is right. And I think that is what is really, I've posted 2 questions there, which are really about being very passive in Botswana. And because of that passiveness and the traditions of being respectful and passiveness, organizations and institutions would tend to, should I say, encroach or not even respect our human rights. And at the same time, because of lack of awareness, because of lack of education, and also because of that passiveness, we tend to allow that to go on. So I was listening to Morten's presentation in Sweden, and I was like, we still have a long way to go in Botswana. And I think working with the local government, especially our councillors, they can be empowered so that they can empower people at the community level to be aware of what is going on, and also have developed this confidence to demand really what is it that you need as a child, as a woman, as a minority, or even as a citizen. And because I heard that human rights is not only about minorities, it's about the population as a whole. And I think those are just my major comments. And I do hope that as Botswana, we learn a lot from this, and at the same time empower our local authorities, especially the councillors, so that they can empower communities to be aware of the socio-economic human rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dorothy, and I'm happy that we can hear your voice despite the difficulties. We have a lot of questions from the chat, but I want to give the word to O'Brien. And some of the questions that I have seen here are related to culture, and also like our human rights, Western culture. Are these something that is actually used at the local level in Zambia, for instance? Like, do people on the streets talk about human human rights? Are there words that are similar in the local languages that you use? Is this perceived as something that is Western, or is this something, how do citizens embrace the issues of human rights? And remember to speak slowly. O'Brien, please.
Thank you very much. Hope I remember to speak slowly. The question on human rights and culture, I think it's a little bit complex. My starting point would be that when you look at the values embedded in the human rights, I think the values embedded in those human rights are universal, even though the way they might be expressed may not be in the same way across the cultures. But what underlies them, I think it's universal. All cultures have respect for, or at least advocate for respect for human life, for example, and want to have freedom from torture, or want to have personal liberty and that kind of stuff. So I think there are fundamental human values, I think, that find expression across cultures and nationalities. That said, I think there are also areas, depending on the context and in our country, I think also the region, where some human rights positions are not universally celebrated, and these tend to be in areas like rights of sexual minorities. Here, I think like in my country, I think there seem to be relative backlash. But that said, the problem for me, I think, is not African culture itself, but I think these are some of the positions local people assumed uncritically, based on, I think, common strands of Christianity they inherited as a result of evangelization or missionaries kind of stuff. So in my view, I think the underlying factors, I think, on which human rights are premised are universal, even though the way they may be framed in documents may not be in line with specific cultures. There's a question, I think, which is more specific to Zambia, discussing the issue of political violence and how this could be addressed. I think this is a big problem. It is primarily not a problem that is originated by local government, but I think it's a national problem that requires dialogue, and it is primarily about contestation for power. Those who are in office, I think, use that as a tool of shrinking political space so that their hold on power is not threatened. So it is, in my view, about the integrity of institutions that are theoretically supposed to be independent and which are supposed to enforce constitutional norms, like the police, the courts, and other institutions. So if these are co-opted, for example, by the ruling party, then that creates a problem, and then which we see where there's street violence, and then the police are just watching. They can't do anything because the police officers fear for their jobs. So in my view, I think that raises questions about the insulation of key institutions, key oversight institutions from political parties, from people in government. So if there's insufficient insulation, which does not allow basically these professional bodies to do their work correctly, then it becomes difficult to fight those problems we see manifested on our streets, and specifically in our context in Zambia. So I think those are manifestations of a bigger problem. Thank you.
Thank you, O'Brien. And I think it's really important what you mentioned about these fundamental values of democracy. I see one of the city councillors from Mugale, Thai, also wrote about the principle of Ubuntu, about this common sense of humanity. We will take just one more question from the audience, and then we will wrap up with a last round briefly. So this last question I want to ask you to answer briefly and think about just to finalize this panel. If there is one advice, like one kind of call for action that you want to give to the municipalities that are starting this journey of working with human rights as part of their partnerships between the Swedish municipalities and the municipalities in South Africa, Zambia, and Botswana, they will work on this for 1 to 3 years. What is your one advice? So think about that, very short, in 1 minute, and Ricard will state the last question that we will take from the audience, and we will save the rest of the questions and try to reflect back to them. Ricard.
Thank you. So the chat is really on fire now, but I chose this one because I don't think we've spoken too much of the supply chain. There's a question also from Thai concerning how the supply chain management policy uses deviation loopholes to misappropriate tax funds, and in a sense that speaks to the risk of corruption and no accountability being accounted for. So that is the question.
Yes, who would like to? Morten, great. And briefly, you have 1 minute.
I can do it in 1 minute. No, I firmly believe that if there's one barrier, or if I should point to one barrier for realizing human rights and what really erodes democracy, then it is exactly what the one who posed the question is about. That's corruption. There's no doubt about it. We have to do away. We just, I mean, if we see how much disappears in tax evasion and corruption, let's link the two, we could fulfill all the SDGs by tomorrow. We need to come to the term, or need to address that much firmer. And what have we? Previously, we always addressed corruption from a prosecution perspective, a perpetrator focus. Fine, we need to, of course, prosecute, no doubt about it, but we also need the victim focus. And that's where human rights now come in, linking human rights and corruption, or fight against corruption, in the sense that what human rights can do is that what we sometimes term as the invisible or even the victimless crime, we can show all the victims, those who do not get access to school, those who do not get access to health. Again, coming back to the corona, where we have seen people dying because they didn't get access to oxygen or even face masks or whatever, but also oxygen, very basic, because of the corrupt regimes that were governing. So in short, it is number one on the international agenda. And we now luckily see that the Office of the High Commissioner throughout their system is now put it very high on the agenda in the fight against hyper inequality. And that's again, the municipalities, the local authorities, a bottom-up approach, there will be a lot, I mean, they have a lot to do here.
Excellent. I like what you said. You are putting a face to this crime that people think that, oh, it's okay, corruption, because everyone does it. But when we think about who are the victims, the children that don't get access to school, or the person that dies because doesn't get the oxygen, then corruption is not as easy to talk about. So we finalize with one recommendation, one good thing to do for the local governments. If they start working tomorrow with human rights, what is this one good thing that you want them to remember in the work? O'Brien, I see that your microphone is unmuted, so if you want to go first.
Thank you very much. So yeah, for me, the one thing I think which I would propose to be addressed, I think which doesn't cost much, is a point where I think which was already raised by Morten, has to do with the reorienting the service providers, the local authorities, in terms of the mentality, the perspective, so that they see themselves not there simply as a cloak of central government, but they should see themselves as key stakeholders in the democratic process, that they are there to deliver the goods of democracy, and they are playing a role in the realization of social and economic rights of their own people. So if we can transform their thinking through probably straightforward workshops and introduce basically a human rights approach to the provision of services, I think that would be fundamental in changing how they go out about doing their work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian. So I get your point. We need to talk about human rights at the local level. We need to do some workshops. We need to bring those ideas into basic knowledge, even start from the beginning. Jaap, do you want to go next?
Yeah, thanks. My recommendation is I'm trying to be very, very practical about this, and so it's not an academic perspective, but a practical perspective. One good thing that we have learned during COVID-19 is that we were able to connect internationally without having to fly to each other. And these kind of municipal partnerships, cynical note, I've also often seen them becoming just opportunities for mutual tourism. You go and visit each other and you have a great time and you make sure you do a few relevant things to justify your holiday. And I think COVID-19 is now forcing us to get together and talk real stuff. So my advice is be realistic and also prioritize and choose themes that really add value to what the municipalities are about. And maybe do not try to deal with all human rights issues at once. There are very specific issues and you can be drawn into so many different directions. Maybe it is about the role of foreign nationals in basic services. Maybe it is about transparency in procurement. Maybe it is about managing public spaces, a human rights perspective to that. So my advice to programmatic advice is try to be realistic, prioritize, and make it matter for the municipalities that are involved. Thanks, Anna.
Thank you, Jaap. We would do that. We will help the municipalities to prioritize and to go straight to the focus. And I am convinced that they are all here with the best intentions. They are champions of human rights and local democracy. Ruth, if you may want to say from Botswana, what is your advice? Let's see if your internet works.
You mean Dorothy?
Yeah, sorry, Dorothy. Thank you, Malaika.
For me, really, the recommendation would be, it's almost the same as Jaap's, where we need to prioritize, because sometimes we tend to bring in a lot of issues regarding human rights. But if we can prioritize and say, for example, in Botswana, we have a serious problem of waste management, gender-based violence, and if we can just prioritize and make sure that we focus on that area for up to 1 year, instead of talking about gender-based violence, waste management, health access and all that, I think that will be my major recommendation. And also, like we've said, using the local government councillors, because they're the ones who are in touch with the communities, and also bringing in a lot of awareness in terms of rights of everybody in the community and not just a specific few. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dorothy. And I think it's really important to mention that all the partnerships include local politicians from the majority and the opposition, and some of them are here with us today. So I think this is really a key issue that we will take care of. Morten, the last word to you. One final advice for our municipalities to engage in this road. It might be bumpy, but we hope that they leave this panel with a sense of engagement and a good call for action.
Thank you. Now, I would say, first and foremost, make it clear that this is not first and foremost a legal issue. It's not about dumping a lot of new laws on the head of the municipalities that they should adhere to, and if they don't, they will get a hammer in the head. That's not what it's about. Of course, there is a legal framework, goes without saying, but it's first and foremost a perspective. It's the human rights-based approach, meaning that you look at the citizen, take the outset in your actions in the citizen, and then work backwards, work it into your procedures So you then always ensure that you have that citizen perspective. And people always claim that they do, and very often they don't. So you really have to work on it. But it's first and foremost a perspective, and then getting the political buy-in to whatever you do. So it becomes a wide political buy-in, not only from one or the other fraction, but a wide buy-in so that it becomes sustainable. So the perspective and the political buy-in. Thank you. It has been a great being here, Anna.
Thank you. And thank you all of you for being here with us until this time. Thank you to our panelists, to Morten, to Jaap, to O'Brien, and to Dorothy also for standing back. Thank you, Ricard, for helping us to organize this. To all the municipalities and the researchers that follow us through the day, we look forward to meeting you all again, and let's take the perspective of human rights in our daily lives from today, as Morten said. So have a wonderful day, and thank you so much.
Thanks, Anna.
Thank you very much.